Hi, I'm Max Keiser, and this is the Keiser Report number 100. That's right, 100 pure, blissful episodes of markets, finance, and scandal. And Stacy Herbert, you're back in the studio. How are you?
Okay, Max Keiser, I have a headline for you. Crowds mob Keiser Report star Banky for autographed silver coins. So if you recall, we did see this man in one of our Crash JP Morgan buy silver videos, and let's just take a look at it.
What a turnout for the Crash JP Morgan buy silver autograph signing today. Thanks to Max Keiser and all of his work on Russia Today.
Binky, you're famous. I saw you on Max Keiser.
Oh, well, thank you. Yes, the paparazzi's really driving me crazy. Can I sign your silver?
Sure.
Okay. 1 ounce of silver. Hey.
Yeah, that's our demographic. It's like Fox News, their demographic is 75 years old and up.
That's
We've
correct.
got the 7 and under.
That's right. So, but speaking of this campaign, I want to look at this one other little headline, $500 silver if you want it. Now, this is a take on
The John Lennon and Yoko Ono. Remember those famous billboards in Times Square? War is over if you want it. And, a whole generation got together and they ended the Vietnam War. This generation needs to get together, and they can, if they want it, get silver to 500 and put the banksters out of business. Remember, this is a political campaign, not a financial campaign. $500 silver basically puts the bankers out of business because all the wealth that they stole is transferred back to you, the individual. And if everybody, 5% of the world's population each buy a silver coin, they win, bankers lose. It's all very John and Yoko. When are we going to get into bed and do a bet-in, by the way? Max and Stacy doing a bet-in. You'd like to see that, wouldn't you? Of course you would. No?
Well,
You seem all flabbergasted by this idea. It seems like a natural, demonstration against the banksters, a Max and Stacy bet-in. We should do the Keiser Report from bed.
well, so the warmongers, as you said, they could be stopped. The warmongers are the same as the banksters. Now, if you want it, now that is in the next headline. The terrorists got everything they wanted. Olli Rehn, no haircuts for senior bondholders. So Olli Rehn is a Finnish politician who's currently serving as European Commissioner for Economic and Monetary Affairs. You see him in this little video, and this is him announcing the 85 billion euro bailout for Ireland. So after he says that the senior bondholders will take no haircut, this is what he says.
In fact, there will be an important self-financing element of Ireland over 17.5 billion euros.
Self-financing. Let's see, where have I heard that before? Oh yeah, it was Chalabi right before the Iraq invasion. He said the Iraq war would be self-financing. Remember, the oil revenues were going to pay for the Iraq invasion. Regardless of the fact that it would have been cheaper for U.S. to just give every Iraqi man, woman, and child $100,000. It would have been cheaper than blowing 3 to 4 or 5 trillion on a campaign to nowhere.
But here's the self-financing. Here's where it's coming from. Remember, senior bondholders take no cuts. Here's where it's coming from. Ireland must find 17.5 billion euros from its pension fund and reserves for bailout.
Well, as I've explained, the problem is that the IMF and the World Bank are bankrupt. They're the institutions that are bankrupt. They see that Ireland's got $20 billion of cash on the balance sheet. They see that pension fund, overfunded pension fund. It's just like these corporate raiders from the 1980s. Remember Carl Icahn or Ivan Boesky, Mike Milken? They looked at these companies, they saw these fat pension accounts, they saw cash, they did leverage buyouts, and they stole the wealth. IMF and the World Bank, same thing. They look at Ireland, they look at Greece, they look at Iceland, they look at Spain, they look at Portugal. They see big fat pension accounts, they see cash, And like these voracious banking monsters, they go in there to do a private equity deal, leverage buyout, and they steal the money. It's the IMF and the World Bank that are bankrupt, not Ireland. The people of Ireland, you have to understand something. You're being sold a bill of goods. You're being sold down the river by your own government that's in bed with a bunch of corrupt bankers at the IMF because they're the bankrupt ones, not you. Too late.
That's correct. You remember the IMF, I guess when it was headed by Paul Wolfowitz, they were about to go bankrupt. Remember, they almost went out of business.
That's right. They have no money. they have no money. They're bankrupt worse than anybody. I mean, you have to understand it's a consortium of bankers. And all these banks, as we know from the banks in the U.S., Citibank or JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs or HSBC or Barclays Bank, they're all technically insolvent. And they all get together to create the World Bank and the IMF. How can the sum of the parts be greater than the bankruptcy of the individual bits? It can't be. That's all bankrupted. It's absurd that they would buy this. Of course, the problem again is that it's what you think it is. If the propaganda is to the Irish people that they need to be taken over and they buy that propaganda, then that's what it is. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Remember, in the age of fiat currency, Stacy, since the 70s, we've had only fiat currencies. There is no supply and demand. There is no economics. It's just financial propaganda. And if you want your own financial propaganda, imagine silver at 500. You can do it if you want it. It's just that simple. You can compete with these guys as well. You've got a brain. You've got an imagination.
Well, Max, by the way, as we're going through this, you're seeing some photos back there. That's of these protests at this bailout from the quote-unquote bailout from the EU and IMF. Now, 10 billion euros of the 85 billion euros will go straight to the crippled banks, and 25 billion euros is being earmarked for bank support in the future, which means it's definitely going to the banksters. They're saying they're earmarking it for future bailouts of the banks. And the interest on these loans is averaging 5.8%. That will amount to 20% of annual tax revenue.
It's a rape of Ireland by IMF and World Bank. They are simply raping that country. It's now a corporate state. It's a vassal state of a international banking cartel. It'll be a corporate playland like Greece. Greece is becoming a place for rich people to park their yachts, and they figured the cheap way to park their yachts in some Greek island is to own the country. This is deferring their cost of their slip rental fees during the season. So now they figure, hey, let's get a great deal on shillelagh sticks. We'll just simply do an LBO of the country, and we'll have all the Irish people working for us for dirt wages. As a matter of fact, that's the one export that Ireland apparently is doing well in. They're actually, we'll put a visual up this on the screen here. They export their dirt.
And now here's a clip from the European Parliament discussing, and this is in the lead up to the bailout, and I have to play it right here because it's the perfect place to do it. And this is Nigel Farage, and he's a UKIP member of Parliament.
Just who the hell do you think you people are? You are very, very dangerous people indeed.
Yes, well, the euro is breaking up. Now, as you know, Jim Rickards, who is a good friend of ours, smart guy, he's quoted often in the financial press, he made the point today that I've been making now for weeks, that the big winner in all this is Germany. Germany, they win two ways. They've got the cheap euro for their export market, and they've got an incapacitated competition that's trying to scramble, making good on all these various bad debt loans. So Germany is the big winner in all this. And remember, after World War II, that's the one thing they didn't want to happen, was to bring it back one Germany, one central bank, one Deutschmark. Too late now. The genie's out of the bottle.
Well, going back to this little clip here, Nigel Farage is saying they're very, very dangerous people indeed because they're they're removing the democracy from the Irish people who do not want to pay. As we were looking at those little the images from the protests, they don't want to pay for the banksters, mostly in this case in Germany and the UK, who are owed, these bankers are owed the most. They're the senior bondholders. Well, let's turn back to the final bit of what Farage says to the European parliamentarians.
But it's even more serious than economics, because if you rob people of their identity, if you rob them of their democracy, then all they are left with is nationalism and violence. I can only hope and pray that the Euro project is destroyed by the markets before that really happens.
Yes, nationalism and violence. Well, it doesn't have to be that way. But if, in fact, you've got a bunch of bankers strangling these economies because they're the bankrupt ones, of course, you're going to have some civil and social unrest. The Economist magazine, remember last year, predicted that there would be social unrest this year because of the bankers stealing people's money. And they tried to handicap which countries were going to be the most violent first, and then they were trying to predict how to rearrange your portfolio to take advantage of this emerging social unrest risk.
Well, so the austerity budget comes in on December 7th, next Tuesday. That's also the day of bankrun2010.com. So there's going to be a European-wide bank run, because if nobody is going to, there is nobody, your national politicians, nor, of course, the European politicians aren't going to protect you. So we have to do it ourselves.
Right, and this is a bank run. Eric Cantona is the famous footballer, has got a video out there. It's gone viral.
We showed it here on Keiser Report 2 weeks ago, in fact.
People love it. He's saying, pull all your money out of the banks. And of course, now you've got a fistful of money. What do you do with it? Go to the people's money, silver. That's what I say. Put those two together, and you've got a great monetary revolution on your hands without having to cut a single head off.
And finally, after the IMF, and if these people do not take the IMF, what does John Perkins always say? Then comes the hitmen. And this takes me to Hillary Clinton ordered diplomats to steal UN officials' credit card numbers.
Oh.
It reminds me of the fact that they were also pushing for collecting credit card data from Europeans who fly, or any SWIFT stuff that goes through Brussels.
Yeah, big data sweep. Well, this is WikiLeaks, right?
This is from WikiLeaks data, yeah.
So Hillary Clinton ordered the UN. Repeat this again. This is so extraordinary that, here you go. Hillary Clinton's engaging in identity theft. She's engaging in identity theft, stealing credit cards from UN to go down to Compton and score some smack. What's up with Hillary Clinton? Does she need to go to rehab or what?
Well, the point is that if the Irish people rise up and throw out their government, if the Irish people refuse to take this loan from the IMF, if the Portuguese people do, if the Greek people do, if the Spanish people do, if they refuse these IMF loans, the U.S. has your credit card details, and they can continue splurging at Walmart on your behalf with your credit card details.
Well, it's a racket, and it's forced debt pushing. They're debt pushers. And whether it's Hillary stealing your credit card so she can go buy a dime bag of smack, or whether it's the IMF or World Bank trying to push billions of dollars worth of worthless junk loans onto your books, it all adds up to the same worthless pile of garbage. Banksters ripping you off, and you sitting there looking for the answers. And the only answer is the answer we've provided on this show.
Episode 100.
Episode 100. Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report, episode 100.
Thank you, Max.
All right, don't go away. We're going to be talking more about the Max and Stacy bet in, so stay right there.
Welcome to the future, bringing you the latest in science and technology from around Russia.
We've got the future covered.
Download the official RT application to your iPhone or iPod Touch from the iTunes App Store. Watch RT live on the go. Video on demand. RT's live broadcasts. And RSS feeds now in the palm of your hand. Question more on RT.com.
Welcome back to the Keiser Report. Time now to go to Chile and speak with Gonzalo Lira.
It's a pleasure being on your show once again.
Now, I want to talk about Ireland in a second, but let's talk about something else first. You were talking about the fundamental flaw that it is the euro, because there's one currency but many bond markets. Tell the people.
Yeah, well, if you think about it, okay, you have one currency for all these, 15 or 16 countries or however many are in the Eurozone. And you have each of them issuing their own debt. So what you basically have is a currency peg, a very sophisticated currency peg. But it's the same thing that happened in Latin America in the 80s. Remember all those small Latin American countries, and they all pegged their currency to the dollar, and they all took advantage of the fact that they were pegged in order to get into debt, over-indebtedness. And eventually, everything went to tears. That's exactly what's happening in the euro, because you have the strong economies in the middle, Germany, France, Holland, and Finland. And you have the weaker economies on the periphery. We all know them, the pigs, Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, Spain. And they all went into debt that they couldn't afford, and now they're paying for it. And the tragedy, of course, is that, see, in the 80s in Latin America, these small countries that had their currency pegged to the dollar could unpeg their currency and let it float to a reasonable level. That happened in just about every country that in Latin America that did that little move. Whereas in the European Union, in the European Monetary Union, they can't do that. They're stuck with the euro. So even though they might be restructuring their debt, as in the case of Greece and now Ireland, maybe Ireland, they're still going to be stuck with the euro, which is going to make them uncompetitive. And so they're going to keep on spiraling down. So they're really just kicking the can down the road. They're not providing a solution to the problem. And the problem is that each country can issue their own debt.
Yeah. Now, when the euro was started, of course, all of these bond markets, these sovereign bond markets, they were yielding approximately the same. The 10, 20, 30-year bonds had approximately the same yield. But then as time progressed and different foibles, if you will, of the underlying countries, different personalities of these countries, that is to say weaknesses, emerged, then the yields started to break away and trade separately. And isn't that kind of a arbitrageur's paradise? And they see these different yields. And there, of course, the big hedge funds out there and the big funds, they've got virtually unlimited credit. They don't make any mistakes, because if they do make a mistake, they get bailed out by their own government, that is to say the U.S. So isn't it just asking for trouble to have all these different rate differentials within the same zone?
Yeah, I mean, I can't contradict you on any one of your points, because you're absolutely correct on all of them. They're just begging for trouble. And of course, what's happening now is that every time that there's a slight weakness in one of the European Eurozone countries' bond markets, all the piranhas just attack it. And I mean, why is Ireland in trouble? Ireland got in trouble 3 weeks ago because Angela Merkel said a few impolitic words about, maybe senior bondholders having to take a haircut or something. And all of a sudden, the entire bond market panics, and, Ireland is just shoved up against the wall and basically raped, if you ask me. And, the same is going to happen now to Portugal, and the same is going to happen to Spain and Italy. It's just, they're just piranhas. And of course, the terrible thing is that if these piranhas were, as you say, independent, well, then okay, it's survival of the fittest. But all these piranhas, i.e. hedge funds, or not hedge funds, the banks really, the prop trades, they're all getting bailed out by the government. The zombie banks are inflicting a lot of this damage. And who is financing the zombie banks? Well, the governments. So it's just this corrupt morass, and I don't know how to fix it except allowing some super crisis to just wipe everybody out and start from scratch. Because I don't see how this incredibly corrupt system can continue. It's just mind-boggling.
Okay, let's examine that a little bit more. You mentioned a couple things I want to explain for the viewer a bit. You said, okay, not so much hedge funds, but the prop desks of these big banks. The too big to fail banks in New York, for example, that have gotten hundreds of billions of dollars in money from the federal government, instead of going bankrupt, they were engaged in huge acts of a moral transgression, moral risk. What do they call that? Moral
hazard.
Moral hazard. Yeah, moral hazard. They got hundreds of billions of dollars to just keep making the same mistake over and over again. So they're fueled with the cash. Then they go into Europe and they pick off these countries, and it's really, I want to ask you something. You're down there, South America in the 80s, of course, and in the 70s, it had the sobriquet, the Banana Republic, and a lot of leaders fell out of airplanes. And there was John Perkins talking about the economic hitmen. And, they went in there, and if they didn't go on to the IMF or the World Bank, they would kill these guys. And it's all documented in John Perkins' excellent book about economic hitmen. But now you've got the same thing as you're describing it, and you're a Latin American expert here and a global economic expert. It's similar in Europe now. You've got the same kind of pressure coming in from these prop desk trading, arbitrageur wielding financial terrorists, as I call them, just picking off these countries one by one. Is Ireland really bankrupt, or is it just suitable for these hedge funds and these funds to pick it off and to destroy it for their own gain?
Just pick them off and destroy for their own gain. I mean, also terrible political decisions by Brian Cowan's government. I mean, the Irish state, in and of itself, was making its year every year. I mean, they were solvent, but what happened was that they took on the burden of their enormous banking system, which they never should have been allowed to have, because the liabilities of their largest banks were over twice the total GDP of Ireland. I mean, there were banks that were too big for that country. But and when these banks started tumbling in 2008, what did Ireland do? They said, "Oh, we're going to guarantee these banks because they're Irish banks." And it's just stupid. I mean, they should have been allowed to fail.
You say the politicians stink, but are they really terrible, or are they compromised, or are they, in other words, these politicians, the bureaucrats, they rotate in and out of these large institutions. A lot of these guys who totally bankrupted Ireland will end up with jobs in the IMF and the World Bank, and it's a revolving door of criminal, larcenistic, no-goodnics. They're burnishing their resume by taking Ireland down, number one. And number two, in terms of, what's your comment on that? In terms of the politicians, they're not just stupid and incompetent. I mean, they have an agenda here, which is to line their own pockets.
Well, actually, I disagree. I always tend to view the best in people. I tend to think that they're just stupid. I don't think that they're particularly corrupt in the sense of like taking a payoff, but perhaps they are. And certainly they have an eye onto future jobs in the World Bank or the IMF or who knows where. Yes. However, I think that they're just incompetent. I think that they just took short-termism and they just ran amok with it. Insofar as Ireland is concerned, you asked me before whether it was the banks that are responsible for this. I have to ask you, who's to blame? The pusher or the drug addict? I mean, the governments keep giving these banks money for free and bailing them out every time they get into a little bit of trouble. And these banks keep on taking this money and spending it and doing reckless bets. And when those reckless bets turn out to be good bets, they give themselves huge bonuses. And when they turn out to be bad bets, they go running to daddy government. So the issue is, who's to blame here? Ultimately, my own thinking is it is the people who are to blame. I mean, at least the Irish, on Saturday, they went out, 50,000 people, at least 50,000 people were out in the Dublin streets protesting this bailout because they don't want it, because they recognize that they're going to be slaves to the IMF and to the EU and the ECB. Now, just to put in context, 50,000 people is roughly 1% of the Irish Republic's population. That would be 3 million people in the United States protesting on Capitol Hill. 3 million people. It's a huge number. And the people of Ireland recognize that they're going to be screwed. And, I think that hopefully over the next coming week, maybe popular discontent will grow to a point where this bailout will not happen. Because do keep in mind, the bailout was approved by the EU finance ministers on Sunday night, but it still has to pass the Irish Parliament on December 7th, which I believe is next Tuesday. December 7th, famously the date that will live in infamy. Well, that's the key date for Ireland. And we have to be paying very close attention to what's going to happen during this coming week to see if the Irish people decide to not accept this bailout and simply default, which I think would be the rational thing to do, to simply default on this debt and restructure the Irish banks and start off with a clean slate. I think that what's going to happen in this coming week is key, and we should be paying very close attention to that December 7th budget vote. Because if Brian Cowan's Fianna Fáil coalition government doesn't have the votes, then this Irish situation will not be over come December 7th. And in fact, I think it'll turn a lot worse.
Right. Well, if you take a page from Iceland's playbook, they let their banks fail. The government did not assume the bank debt. They took the hit, and now they're rebuilding.
Everybody is bankrupt. That's the bottom line. Now, the issue is, are we going to kick the can down the road or just hunker down, take the hit like the Icelanders did? Take the hit and just get it over with. I mean, I'm always in favor of just taking the hit now rather than later, because later it's going to be worse. But of course, it's a politically unpopular decision to make. And so, you have what's going on now in Ireland, that they're trying to kick the can down the road. And I think it's a lot of the Irish people who recognize that now would be the time to take the pain and suffering, because it'll be longer in the long run. I mean, it'll hurt more in the long run. So, it's a mess. Everybody's broke. They should just get it over with. But it's trying to recapture the glory days and trying to go back to a time that in and of itself was a fairyland. I mean, it wasn't real, but trying to go back to those good old days, that's killing the world economy. And that's why the whole world economy, if you think about it, is grinding down into a depression. I mean, everybody talks about the Black Day, the famous Black Day, the day after Thanksgiving, which is a big, sales day in the United States. It was only 0.3% higher than the year before. I mean, what does that tell you? It tells you that people are hunkering down. There's no growth. There's no consumption. I mean, those days are gone. I mean, so we might as well try to move forward and try to rebuild and make all the sacrifices that have to be made now, and do like the Icelanders are doing. Take the hit.
So the Celtic tiger has a thorn in its paw, and it should pull that thorn out immediately instead of letting it stay in there and fester.
Yeah, and otherwise it'll just turn into gangrene.
Gangrene, and they got to cut it off, and then you're going to have all those leprechauns extinct. And that's it, no more. But they have a very vibrant export market in dirt. People like to buy Irish dirt and give them a sense of the old days before the IMF came and made them all debt slaves. All right, Gonzalo Lira, thanks again for being on the Keiser Report. Great to talk to you again.
It's a pleasure as always. Thanks, Max.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Gonzalo Lira. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.